Among the symbolic figures in astrology, the moon is often misunderstood. Popular treatments reduce it to moods, intuition, or emotionality. But this is reductive. In serious astrology, the moon represents a foundational psychic structure, the internal system responsible for regulating affect, preserving continuity of subjective experience, and constructing a sense of emotional safety. The moon is not ephemeral or secondary. It is the first psychic architecture we inhabit, the container for our earliest experiences and the framework through which we process all future encounters. If the sun represents the conscious self as it develops over time, the moon reflects the pre-conscious substrate of the self, the emotional and somatic impressions that precede language, logic, and volition. This lecture will treat the moon as a psychological and symbolic function, not a mood tracker, but a deep imprinting mechanism that governs adaptation, defense, comfort, and internalized memory. The moon as psychic infrastructure. The moon in astrology represents the infrastructure of the psyche. It is not concerned with identity per se, but with continuity of experience, the internal mechanisms that allow the individual to feel safe, contained, and emotionally regulated over time. This infrastructure forms in infancy, shaped not by volitional decisions but by patterns of care, rhythms of interaction, and the body's responses to the surrounding environment. As such, the moon in the chart speaks to one's emotional ecology, the learned internal conditions that allow the self to feel held. Where the sun represents self-definition, the moon represents self-maintenance. It is not about becoming, but about being, how the organism sustains its cohesion moment to moment. The moon and emotional memory. The moon governs memory, not declarative memory or fact recall, but emotional memory. This is the body's deep record of felt experience. It includes not only specific recollections but the cumulative imprint of how one has been received, held, or rejected by the world. In Jungian terms, the moon relates to the personal unconscious, particularly the sediment of pre-verbal emotional experience. These early impressions are not stored as narrative. They are encoded somatically and emotionally. The moon reflects how these unconscious memories shape perception, reactivity, and behavior in the present. To understand someone's moon is to understand what they implicitly expect from life, what they fear without knowing why, and what conditions they unconsciously recreate to maintain emotional equilibrium. The moon and adaptive functioning. The moon is a system of adaptation. It governs how we respond to environmental stimuli, particularly those that touch our emotional or physiological boundaries. This includes attachment behavior, how we seek closeness, comfort, and reassurance. Defensive mechanisms, how we withdraw, protect, or soothe ourselves under threat. Affective regulation, how we manage internal states of stress, overwhelm, or vulnerability. The moon is not about what one feels in a singular sense, but about how one organizes, contains, and metabolizes feeling. It reflects whether one feels safe enough to stay emotionally open, or whether survival requires contraction, avoidance, or habitual defense. In this way, the moon also governs patterns of behavior that are unconscious but functional, the strategies we develop to ensure continuity of internal stability. The moon and subjective experience. Where the sun is objective, concerned with identity, values, and action, the moon is subjective. It refers to the interior lens through which experience is filtered. The moon does not concern itself with external meaning, but with internal resonance. It tells us how experience feels. This includes the felt tone of relationships, the textures of place and atmosphere, the rhythm of life's emotional highs and lows. It is through the moon that experience becomes personal. The same objective event may be processed entirely differently by different moon structures. This subjectivity is not error or bias, it is a vital part of human meaning-making. The moon and the body. The moon is intimately connected to the body, not as a vehicle, but as a container of lived experience. Somatic astrology emphasizes the moon as the symbolic correlate of the nervous system, the digestive system, and the circadian rhythms that regulate bodily life. The moon tracks what is internalized, emotionally, nutritionally, sensorily. It reflects how one absorbs and integrates life. This can be literal, for example eating and sleeping habits, but more often it is metaphorical, how one takes in the world and processes its impact. A dysregulated moon may manifest as somatic symptoms, fatigue, hypersensitivity, appetite disturbances, or chronic stress states. These are not purely physical. They are the body's attempt to compensate for emotional overload or unmet needs. The moon and early imprinting. Perhaps more than any other astrological symbol, the moon speaks to early developmental conditions. These include the prenatal environment, the experience of birth and bonding, the rhythms of caregiving, the consistency or inconsistency of emotional attunement. In psychodynamic terms, the moon reflects the internalized mother, not the literal parent, but the inner representation of care, containment, and responsiveness. This is the template for emotional relating that becomes internalized in the psyche. It is this template that later informs how one seeks comfort, how one tolerates vulnerability, and what one expects from close relationships. To interpret the moon is to examine the core emotional blueprint around which all subsequent relational experiences are built. The moon and rhythmic life. The moon is inherently cyclical. It waxes and wanes, representing the changing nature of emotional life. This rhythm is crucial to its symbolic role. It describes not only content, but pattern, the habitual emotional cycles we live within. These rhythms show up in mood fluctuations, relationship dynamics, patterns of retreat and return, the ebb and flow of emotional energy. To work with the moon is not to seek constancy, but to recognize and work within natural cycles of receptivity, withdrawal, nurturance, and renewal. Emotional life is not linear, and the moon reminds us that psychic health involves respecting rhythm. The moon and psychic defense. Because the moon governs internal regulation, it also governs psychic defense. When the environment is hostile or overwhelming, the moon activates protective strategies to preserve the organism's emotional integrity. These defenses may include emotional withdrawal or dissociation, hypervigilance, idealization of caretakers or partners, repetition compulsions. These are not flaws but strategies of self-preservation. The moon governs not only vulnerability but the mechanisms that prevent it from being overwhelmed. However, when these defenses become rigid or unconscious, they can inhibit growth. A mature moon allows for flexible defense, the capacity to open or close depending on context, rather than living in a chronic state of shutdown or exposure. The moon and nurturance. One of the moon's most essential symbolic functions is nurturance, both given and received. The moon describes how one provides care, but more importantly, how one allows oneself to receive it. Nurturance is not merely kindness or sentimentality. It involves attunement, responsiveness, and presence. It also involves containment, the ability to hold space for discomfort, pain, and process without immediate solution. The moon's condition in the chart reflects whether the individual feels safe enough to receive care, or whether past experiences have made self-sufficiency a form of protection. Emotional nourishment requires not only external provision, but internal permission. The moon and emotional intelligence. Contrary to its stereotypical portrayal, the moon is not irrational. It is emotional, but emotion is a form of intelligence. The moon governs empathy, attunement to emotional nuance, the ability to track inner states over time. the capacity to emotionally connect without losing oneself. This form of intelligence is not analytic but relational. It is not about information, but resonance. Those with a highly developed moon often have strong intuitive insight, not in a magical sense, but as a refined sensitivity to emotional tone and atmosphere. The moon teaches us to listen, not only to others, but to the self beneath the self, the part that feels before it knows, that remembers without words, and that seeks connection as a condition of wholeness. The moon and the need for belonging. At a social level, the moon governs belonging. Not ideological alignment or shared interests, but the visceral, pre-verbal sense of being home, in oneself, with others, in the world. This sense of belonging is not abstract. It is registered somatically, the difference between relaxation and alertness, between openness and guardedness. The moon governs this terrain. Astrologically, the moon often speaks to one's emotional homeland, not necessarily cultural or geographic, but psychic. It is the texture of familiarity, the language of comfort, the atmosphere of one's native emotional life. To be alienated from one's moon is to feel exiled from the self. To reclaim it is to return home, not to the past, but to the possibility of inner safety in the present. The moon's developmental task. Unlike the sun, which represents a process of outward self-actualization, the moon represents a task of inward stabilization. Its developmental trajectory involves moving from reactivity to responsiveness, from unconscious defense to conscious self-soothing, from external dependence to internal security. The moon must evolve from a passive imprint of early experience into an active container for the self. This involves integrating unmet needs, soothing old wounds, and developing new rhythms of care and self-holding. A mature moon is not emotionless, nor is it endlessly expressive. It is regulated, responsive, grounded, receptive, and self-respecting. The moon in astrology is not simply a symbol of emotion. It is the architecture of our inner world, the container that makes emotion livable, memory bearable, and connection possible. It governs how we feel, not just in moments of intensity, but in the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. It shows us what we need in order to rest, to trust, and to return to ourselves after we've been scattered by the world. In many ways, the moon represents the psychological foundation upon which all other functions stand. Without it, the sun cannot shine consistently. Identity collapses under the weight of unmet needs. Without it, relationships falter, not for lack of love, but for lack of emotional safety. To understand the moon is to understand not who someone is, but how they are, how they process life, how they remember, how they cope, how they care, how they come home to themselves. Astrology does not begin with personality, it begins with containment. And that containment is the work of the moon.